We have our final keynote presentation, and we are so pleased to have James Romm with us here today. So James is an author, reviewer, and the James H. Ottaway Jr. Professor of Classics at Bard College in Annandale, New York. His reviews and essays have appeared in The New Yorker, The Wall Street Journal, the London Review of Books, the Daily Beast, and other venues. He's held the Guggenheim Fellowship, among others, and is the author of many excellent books, including Dying Every Day, Seneca at the Court of Nero, and Plato and the Tyrant, The Fall of Greece's Greatest Dynasty and the Making of a Philosophic Masterpiece. Both of these are excellent books, and I highly recommend them if you haven't read them yet. So, James, thank you so much for being here with us today. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Brittany, and thank you to Phil and the conference organizers. As a historian and a classicist, I'm going to bring a slightly different perspective to the themes that we've been discussing. So let me launch right in. If you're a committed Stoic and a phone call comes asking you to serve at the highest level of an autocratic government, what would you do? What should you do? Say you agree to serve and become chief minister to the ruler, but discover he's immoral, corrupt, vain, and only loosely tethered to reality. What should you do? Should you remain in service in hopes of keeping the state from imploding? Or should you preserve your own soul by getting as far from the palace as possible? Then, imagine you have a huge social media following with millions reading your every online post. Should you use your platform to agitate against the regime or to support it? Or would you ignore it altogether and pretend you weren't involved? How would your Stoic philosophy guide you in navigating the ultimate test of the question of civic engagement? A situation in which, in order to stay engaged, you either have to collude in horrendous abuses or else put your own life at risk by refusing to collude. The scenario I've sketched is the one that confronted the Roman Stoic Seneca the Younger in the 1st century AD, except that instead of a telephone call, he received a summons delivered by messenger to the island of Corsica, where he'd been sent into exile. And instead of a social media feed, he had a large readership for the moral essays that he'd begun to publish while on Corsica and kept on publishing throughout the remaining 33 years of his life. He was summoned to Rome to assume the post of tutor to teenage Nero, the heir apparent to the emperorship. After Nero's accession, at age 17, Seneca served in a role that we might compare to White House Chief of Staff, a trusted insider with access to all the right people, responsible for making sure things ran smoothly, consulted by Nero on most key questions of state. Seneca's first English language biographer, a woman named Miriam Griffin, dubbed him in the title of her study, a philosopher in politics, though some, myself included, have wondered whether that phrase shouldn't be reversed to characterize Seneca as a politician in philosophy. That question aside, let me focus on the ethical issues that Seneca's story raises and how they relate to the theme of Stoicon 2025. As noted in many of today's discussions, Stoicism advocates service to humankind, which often involves political participation and activism, in contrast to Epicureanism, known in antiquity as the garden because it sanctioned withdrawal into a private realm where the soul would be protected from discord. In one of his essays, On the Tranquility of Mind, Seneca uses an extended military metaphor to contrast the two schools of thought, Epicureanism and Stoicism, extolling the latter and rejecting the former. To withdraw into private life, he writes, is equivalent to military desertion. As soldiers in the army of moral effort, we must keep to our place in the phalanx, that is, in public life. Quote, even if others will occupy the front line and fate has set you back in the third row, Seneca tells his addressee, fight from there with your voice, encouragement, example, and spirit, even with hands cut off. The person who stands firm and gives support with his shouts finds something to contribute to his side. Then, drawing the lesson from the analogy, Seneca continues, if fortune has displaced you from the first level in government, stand and give support with your shouting. If someone chokes you by the throat, stand and give support with your silence. The effort of a good citizen is never useless. As often in his essays, Seneca cites the example of Socrates, the Greek philosopher to whom he looked for models of moral virtue, in examining the question of civic engagement. Seneca claims in On the Tranquility of Mind that Socrates had remained engaged during the reign of the 30 tyrants at Athens, a harsh authoritarian regime that put to death hundreds of its political enemies. Quote, Socrates was openly out in public life. He bore himself as a mighty example, walking as a free man among 30 slave masters. Again, Seneca spells out the lesson to be drawn. Quote, however the government presents itself, we shall either expand ourselves or shrink ourselves in such a way that we shall be taking action, not paralyzed or strangled with fear. For burying oneself is not a form of salvation. That last quote seems like a clear-cut call for political activism, but Seneca's views are rarely clear-cut. The example of Socrates, for example, in fact goes two ways, as Seneca was undoubtedly aware. Yes, Socrates had refused to go into retreat under the regime of the 30, but neither did he challenge that regime. When ordered by the 30 to arrest one of its enemies and bring him in for execution, Socrates had simply gone home and done nothing. An act of resistance, perhaps, but a passive and silent one, hardly a case of give support with your shouting. Then, too, Seneca concludes the whole discussion with a huge qualification of his preceding exhortations. If you happen upon a less flexible period of politics, he tells his addressee, you will have to see to it that you claim more time for leisure and study, just as you would make quickly for the harbor on a dangerous voyage. You should not wait for public affairs to send you away, but extricate yourself from them. Less flexible sounds like a euphemism for authoritarianism or autocracy, the system under which Socrates had briefly operated during the reign of the 30, and in which Seneca spent his entire life. Which metaphor, army or navy, are we to take as Seneca's definitive view? Are we to stand in the phalanx and shout, even with our hands cut off? Or are we to leave open waters for safe anchorage when the seas get choppy? Seneca's own career, as we shall see, shows that he was unsure how to resolve this dilemma. But first, let me look at another of Seneca's essays, On Leisure. In this treatise, probably addressed to the very same person as On Tranquility of Mind, Seneca shares very different thoughts about politics, much more sympathetic to the possibility of disengagement. In the beginning of the surviving portion of this essay, its opening has unfortunately been lost. An opponent to Seneca's views is heard arguing about staying active in politics no matter what. The opponent says to Seneca, surely your Stoics say, we shall remain in active service right up to the very end of life, without ceasing to apply ourselves to the common good, accusing Seneca of verging closer to Epicurean thought than to Stoic. Seneca then defends his views using multiple arguments. First, he claims that leading Stoics, Zeno and Chrysippus, had kept aloof from politics, so others have a right to follow their lead. Note how this conflicts with his evocation of Socrates in On Tranquility of Mind. Second, Seneca recurs to a view that he attributes to Zeno that, quote, the wise man will participate in public life unless something prevents him. Well, says Seneca, that let-out clause might be invoked for numerous reasons. Perhaps the sage has insufficient power to be of help. Perhaps the state is so vicious and corrupt that it cannot accept his help. Or perhaps the sage is physically debilitated. Thus, Seneca argues, it's possible for someone who has all options before him, before experiencing any of life's storms, to settle in a safe retreat and devote himself from then on to liberal studies, and to spend time in uninterrupted leisure. More or less as one would do in the garden of Epicurus. Seneca resolves this apparent abandonment of Stoic principles by positing that there are two republics that one might benefit by one's actions, a smaller one, the state or the nation of which one is a citizen, and a larger one, the entire human race. This greater commonwealth, says Seneca, we can serve with devotion even in leisure. Or rather, I think even better in leisure, by inquiring what virtue is, whether it is one or many, whether this planet, which includes within it seas and land masses, exists alone, or whether God has scattered many such bodies, whether the world is immortal, or to be counted among things that are perishable. Seneca then asks, what service to God does the contemplator of such matters provide? That God's great works are not without witness. Seneca elaborates on this last thought with reference to the central Stoic principle, live in harmony with nature. Personifying this nature as an entity with will and intention, Seneca asserts that nature wants to be contemplated. Quote, aware of its own skill and its beauty, it gave us life to be spectators of its great spectacle, since it would lose all pleasure in itself if it displayed its works, so vast, so bright and beautiful, to an empty solitude. He goes on to extol pursuits like cosmology and astronomy in rapturous tones as fulfillments of this divine imperative that nature's spectacle must be witnessed. Then he comes back to the original problem, whether withdrawal from public life is permissible under Stoic principles. But nature wished me to do both, he writes, to be active and to be free for contemplation. He resolves the problem with an intriguing and potentially problematic formulation. And I am doing both, he says, since even contemplation entails action. At this point, the opponent steps into the discourse again, and he's clearly not happy. Contemplation, the opponent points out, can be undertaken in a spirit of pleasurable withdrawal, taking the sage entirely away from action. Seneca concedes the point, but turns the tables by pointing out that action without contemplation, the life of the career politician, for example, is just as much a violation of nature. Then he again appears to give the Stoic sage a let-out clause that allows for rejection of politics. Quote, if what is lacking is not the doer, but the tasks to be done, surely then you will allow the sage to consort with himself? It's a cryptic sentence, but one that I think can be understood in the context of the Roman autocracy. For many people, indeed almost all, political action is simply not an available option, and so need not be pursued. Seneca has once again drifted far from the irrepressible soldier of Tranquility of Mind, who shouts when he has no hands and bears mute witness when his voice is choked off. And just as Seneca retreats here from his earlier infantry metaphor, so he also modifies his nautical one. All the philosophic schools endorse contemplation, he writes, but some, that is, the Epicureans, make contemplation the goal, whereas for the Stoics, quote, it's a place to ride at anchor, not a harbor. That's a bit difficult to unpack, but I think we should interpret ride at anchor to mean pause from action but still stay in the public sphere, just as a moored ship remains on open water, even though its oars are shipped and its sails are reefed. Whereas to seek harbor means total withdrawal. Just what he's advocating in terms of political action is hard to say. In the last segment of On Leisure, Seneca deals with let out clause number 2 of the 3 he first proposed, namely, the idea that the state may be so corrupt that the sage cannot influence it or be heard by it. Here, Seneca's grant of license to withdraw becomes nearly a blanket amnesty. I ask you, to what commonwealth is the sage going to attach himself? Seneca asks. To that of the Athenians, where Socrates was condemned to death? You can't tell me that the sage will attach himself to this commonwealth. If I wanted to make a survey of commonwealths, I wouldn't find a single one that could tolerate or be tolerated by the sage. And if no commonwealth can be found of the sort that we visualize for ourselves, leisure turns out to be the inescapable option for all. In a final sentence of this discussion, Seneca reverts to seafaring as a metaphor for political life. If one were told not to set sail on waters where ships are wrecked and sudden storms can arise, one would never set sail at all. And there, apparently, the matter rests, though it's possible that this essay on leisure is truncated at its end and that we don't have the full ending. We can easily imagine what the opponent would have said if he had been allowed to step back in. Seneca, he would say, isn't this a recipe for total political non-participation by virtuous men, meaning that the government will be run by the vicious? Aren't you laying down arms, to evoke your own analogies, and letting the other side have the run of the field? And is it really adequate to say contemplation entails action, as though merely gazing at the stars somehow fulfills Zeno's dictum that the wise men will take part in public life? This seems to be an abdication of duty, thinly justified by your famously sinuous rhetorical and verbal skills. How Seneca might answer those arguments is unclear to me. In fact, Seneca's thinking on the question of engagement is so varied and so all over the map as to elicit one of my favorite takedowns in all of classical scholarship. In discussing Seneca's magnum opus, the Letters to Lucilius, sometimes also called the Moral Epistles, biographer Miriam Griffin says as follows: there is such a wealth of advice on the subject of engagement that it is difficult, if not impossible, to give an account of Seneca's view which would produce a consistent and coherent system. In Seneca's defense, that variousness of opinion may not be merely the sign of sloppy thinking, but rather of the inner conflict Seneca himself experienced in his attempt to be a philosopher in politics or a politician in philosophy, that is, to combine the highest level of political action with a commitment to contemplation of nature and study of philosophy. In advising others how to negotiate this tension, he may have been talking about himself. His life, after all, posed the ultimate test of whether a corrupt state or a delusional ruler could listen to a wise man. For a while at least, that ruler did listen. The first 5 years of Nero's reign were widely judged a success, in large part because of Seneca's influence, and that of Seneca's close ally in the palace, a man named Burrus. Nero was in his late teens and early 20s in these years, and willing to be governed by wiser heads, including by his mother. But tensions grew as the emperor matured and rebelled against his mother's influence, finally deciding in 62, after 7 years in power, that his mother had to be killed. The ensuing assassination, to which Seneca was a co-conspirator, according to the historian Tacitus, is generally marked out by historians as the start of Nero's downward spiral into mania and delusions, a spiral that took him increasingly far from Seneca's influence. The death of Burrus at about the same time also diminished Seneca's clout and pushed him toward the sidelines of the imperial palace. Probably at about this time, Seneca composed the darkest, most harrowing among his 10 surviving tragic plays, the play Thyestes, and I'd like to bring that play into this discussion of Stoic civic engagement. I should say that it's not the usual thing to discuss Seneca's plays as opposed to his prose works in the context of Stoic philosophy. The plays sometimes seem so far from the essays as to be the work of a different author. Indeed, Renaissance humanists thought that they were from a different hand, and one can find a few scholars who still believe that today. But most classicists acknowledge these plays as authentic Senecan works, perhaps composed as a way for their author to look at the world through a different and a mythic lens. None of the plays can be dated with certainty, but as I've argued elsewhere, Thyestes seems to reflect in a deeply personal way the circumstances of Seneca's place at the court of Nero in the 60s AD. For the play casts its title character, Thyestes, as a philosopher drawn into politics and utterly destroyed as a result. The myth on which the play is based concerns two royal brothers, Atreus and Thyestes, the sons of Tantalus, and rivals for the throne of Argos. In most versions of the myth, these two brothers are equally determined to rule, but Seneca has diverged from that plot. He's cast Thyestes as an ascetic sage who, when the play begins, is in a meditative retreat, far removed from the seat of power. That is, he's practicing the sort of withdrawal that Seneca recommends to wise people who inhabit corrupt commonwealths. He comes on stage speaking the following words. "Go back," he tells himself, "back to your forest den, the close-packed groves, the life you shared with beasts, beastly itself. The sheen of power should not mislead you with its meretricious gleam." Like some St. John the Baptist crying in the wilderness, this unaccommodated man seeks the peace of the wilderness and a life of shaggy primitivism. He regards politics as a source of vice and peril. Yet here he is, in Argos, at the doors of the palace, scarcely knowing what forces have brought him there or why he does not turn and flee. Ultimately, he will enter the palace and there suffer the grimmest fate of any figure from mythology. He will unknowingly consume his own children, whom his brother has butchered and simmered into a stew. It's risky to assume that Thyestes is a stand-in for Seneca himself. Nonetheless, I think this play contains one of Seneca's more personal and authentic statements about the danger to the philosopher of political engagement, as well as of the forces that impelled him into Nero's palace. When Thyestes thinks his brother is going to share the throne of Argos with him, make him co-ruler, he drinks and celebrates riotously, bidding himself in a haunting line to banish the old Thyestes from your mind. The rapid flip-flop from renunciation of power to joyful embrace of it calls into question just who this old Thyestes was, the hermit who claimed to prefer a primitive life. Seneca, too, had readily grasped at a scepter when it was offered. In his letters to Lucilius, he admits that one flaw in particular had stood in the way of his progress towards Stoic perfection, namely ambition. Turning back for a moment to Seneca's biographical record, we read in Tacitus's Annals that Seneca finally did try to extricate himself from political life at a point where his influence had waned and Burrus, his principal ally, was dead. Tacitus relates a private conversation between Seneca and Nero, in which the philosopher offered to give up his entire estate, an enormous aggregate of land and wealth, if he could be allowed to leave the palace for good. Nero refused, but the offer nevertheless does Seneca huge credit, aligning him with his own advice in On Leisure. If, that is, we believe that the episode really took place. In my book, Dying Every Day, I took Tacitus at his word and presented this episode as part of the factual record. But in the intervening years, I've become more skeptical about this. One has to wonder what source Tacitus could have had for a private conversation of this kind. And one has to take account of the effort following Seneca's death, extending into the years when Tacitus wrote, to rehabilitate Seneca's reputation and whitewash his collusion with Nero. A remarkable play survives from this post-Seneca era, in which Seneca and Nero are central characters, dramatized by some anonymous author who wanted his audience to understand their relationship. This unknown playwright gave Seneca a moving speech in which the sage laments his return to Rome, when he could have remained in a peaceful exile on Corsica, observing the stars and planets. The idea that Seneca had gone unwillingly into the palace jibes with the idea reported by Tacitus that he had stayed there unwillingly. Both texts providing a valuable moral salve to those who might feel pained by Seneca's political activities. So I don't know at this point how far I can trust Tacitus in this matter or in a later passage where he reports that after requesting to be excused from the palace and refused, Seneca tried his best to stay out of the public eye, to the point of feigning illness in order to stay in his room. A skeptic might ask, could this not be a way to put a positive spin on what was observed by the public, that Seneca no longer walked at the emperor's side, when the explanation might easily be that Nero had simply grown tired of his former tutor and didn't include him in the inner circle? These are insoluble questions, even though they lie at the heart of the larger mystery. How much or how little did Seneca want to be or try to be at the heart of Roman government? But Tacitus supplies an even more pressing question, also insoluble, but fascinating to contemplate: whether Seneca wanted or tried to become emperor. I'll close by recounting this remarkable episode, to my mind, the most bewildering one in Seneca's bewildering story. In 65 AD, a conspiracy formed to assassinate Nero and place a senator named Piso on the throne in his place. A large number of senators and high officials took part, including Seneca's nephew, the poet Lucan. It's not known whether Seneca himself was involved. although after the plot came to light, Nero assumed that he was and ordered him to commit suicide, resulting in the death scene recorded by Tacitus and depicted by prominent Renaissance and Enlightenment artists. The only evidence against Seneca was a letter that he had sent to Piso, declining to meet him personally, but wishing Piso well. In Nero's eyes, a signal that Seneca knew and approved of the plot. Whether Seneca intended any such meaning is anyone's guess, but given Lucan's central role in the conspiracy, it seems unlikely that Seneca did not know of its existence. Tacitus then reports a rumor that circulated in his own day and admits he cannot vouch for its veracity. He has heard that the soldiers involved in the plot intended to kill Piso after killing Nero and make Seneca emperor instead. He then adds, again with the caveat that this is rumor he cannot vouch for it, that Seneca knew of this plot within a plot that would have resulted in his own elevation to supreme power. In examining this remarkable rumor in my book, Dying Every Day, I wrote, "Here is the measure of how little in the end we understand Seneca. We cannot know that had Rome acclaimed him, he would have declined to rule." Well, I hate to end this marvelous Stoicon meeting with huge, unanswerable questions, but Seneca cannot help but leave us with those. In contrast to Epictetus, the former slave who had no political role and didn't want one, or to Marcus Aurelius, who pursued and then wielded absolute power, Seneca occupies a messy middle ground in both his life and his writings. He feels the pull both of civic engagement and of withdrawal from the public sphere into a realm of quiet contemplation. He urges us at different times to fight in the front lines of politics and to seek a safe harbor away from the riptides and storms. Perhaps his ultimate lesson is that there is no dogma that will guide us through troubled civic waters. Our choices must be guided by circumstance, what kind of state we inhabit, what capacity we have to exert influence, and to what degree we endanger our safety by activism. Stoicism is complex and contingent enough to justify many pathways through troubled times. Perhaps under that principle, we can say that Seneca passed the ultimate test of participation at the court of Nero. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, James Romm. And I know our audience is showing their appreciation right now. So please continue to ask your questions in the chat. We do have several questions coming in from the audience. Phil, did you want to add anything before we jump into the questions?
I love, I feel like everybody else in the chat has already said, I love Dying Every Day. I think it's fantastic. James has so much other work that's out there as well. His version of On Anger is one of my favorites to come back and contemplate. But I think but James is this tension, right? James, you are a historian rather than a Stoic primarily. Is that how you describe yourself? So the thing is, you're going to tell us the unvarnished truth about Seneca from time to time, and it's not the Seneca we thought we knew.
I'm afraid that's right. When one reads his moral essays, one can idealize him as a Stoic sage or someone on the path to being a sage. And when one looks closely at his life in politics at the court of Nero, one sees a different picture. And that my book was an effort to hold the two together or to maybe shuttle back and forth between them, but to raise the whole problem of just what kind of person he was.
Yeah, I think it's, when we start, of course, many of us come through Stoicism, through the letters, right? There just seems like so much great practical advice. If we all had an Uncle Seneca telling us how we might act in tough situations, that would be fantastic. And then, but some people like don't get past that point and they don't understand the whole story, or they hear some piece of it. And by the way, I just tell them, go find James's book, Dying Every Day, read this book. And then, you've got an image of the whole person. It doesn't change the great teaching that might be inside those letters and some of the essays on leisure, and you've mentioned as well. I'm a big fan of the Constancy of the Wise Man, right?
Mhm.
I think there's a lot of material in there that's pretty useful. He contemplated the idea of the sage, but if we want to get the whole person, you have to kind of lean back even further. And I don't think the plays don't quite do that, because that does in fact feel like it's somebody else that wrote those.
Yes, and it's remarkable that Miriam Griffin, his scholarly biographer, didn't consider the plays at all. She
Yeah.
wrote a book of, 300 or 400 pages and didn't once raise the problem of the plays because she just didn't consider it relevant to her account. So that's really a stretch when you have to encompass the essays, the political life, and the tragedies.
Yeah, and you went right for Thyestes. So, I mean, you went right to the heart of some really difficult and tragic story. So, thank you for that. Brittany, I think you probably grabbed a few questions from either yourself or the audience. Let me pass it to you. Otherwise, I'll just hold James here until he makes us go home.
Yeah, well, first I have a question on my own behalf. I'm just curious, James. We rarely talk about literature or drama in the context of moral instruction for Stoicism. And I'm wondering, in today's context, do you see any, I don't know, any value, or are there any particular works that you think could play a similar role to what this played for Seneca for his dramatic works? Are there any plays? Is there any literature we can read today? And I'm talking more about contemporary or modern works of art that could explore this tension in a way that Seneca did in the past. Do we have anything we can turn to today to see how this plays out at on a personal or emotional level?
Um, Speaking of modern entertainment or modern literature and art, well, I think that most of the best modern art and literature continues to ask these kinds of questions or force us to consider these kinds of questions. Um, you know, um, Plays of Tom Stoppard and Pinter and um, Sam Shepard and those people, they're still asking the same questions as Senecan drama or Greek tragedy asks, um, often using myth in order to do it. Uh, I just came from a performance in the Berkshires of Mary Zimmerman's Metamorphoses, a beautiful rendition of Ovid's tales from Ovid's Metamorphoses, and she brought those myths right into the modern world beautifully.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is such a powerful tool that we don't talk about very much today, and we probably should.
Hmm.
But moving back to ancient history, we had a question. To my understanding, neither Epictetus nor Marcus Aurelius mention Seneca in any of their attributed writings. If this is true, do you think it's an indictment or an oversight?
That's a great question. Um, we we don't have much evidence that Seneca was read as a philosopher. He was read as a stylist, and Quintilian, who lived in between Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, uh, mentions that all the young men of his day were still quoting lines from Seneca, that they loved his style. And we have in the city of Pompeii, which was again, destroyed in between those 2 points. We have the lines of Senecan drama that someone scrawled on the wall, like you'd write lyrics from a song on a bathroom wall today, it's going through your head and you just want to write it out. So I think he was renowned more for his style than his content. And the philosophers, Marcus Aurelius, they went back to the Greeks primarily, and then, as you say, to Epictetus. Marcus went back to Epictetus.
Okay, thank you. Another interesting question. So, what sort of emperor do you think Seneca might have made had he become emperor?
Yes, that's a fascinating question. Uh, well, Claudius had been emperor before Nero and was widely mocked and derided as a kind of old fart. Um, and I think, Seneca would have taken power in his mid 60s. To judge by his portrait, he was bald and pudgy and not a very inspiring figure. And of course, the Romans loved to have an emperor who was young, strong, physically vigorous, handsome. And Seneca was none of those things. So I think he might have had a tough time. It's fascinating to think that the Praetorians wanted him, if Tacitus's rumor is true, that the Praetorians saw him as a valid choice. But I think probably they saw him as an interim choice, that he wouldn't live long. He was congenitally sick from a respiratory illness, and they thought, well, he'd be a good transitional figure and, keep things together until we get the next guy.
Yeah, it's always interesting to think about. So we have a comment from John Kuna, who he phrases it just as a comment, but I'd like to put it to you as a question. So he says, I know of far too many civil servants who have had to decide between those two painful options. One, stay in to mitigate the worst of it for as long as they can and risk compromising their character in the process, or two, leave with their character intact, but also leave behind a mission they care deeply about.
Mm.
Both can be reasonable responses. It depends on your roles and your own capacities. Most of those who leave tend to continue to serve in some form or to speak out against what is happening. So this
Mm.
was his statement, and I just wanted to put that to you as a question. Do you, based on your study of Seneca, do you have any suggestions for someone who finds themselves in this position today? I mean, it's easy for us to look back at Seneca's life and say, well, he obviously should have done that. But
Mhm.
obviously, when you're in the middle of it, you don't know maybe what the best path is. So based on your history, your reading of history, what would you offer to these people in this situation?
Mhm. It's so much a question of conscience, and I really don't presume to advise to suggest any advice. Um, there is virtue in both paths, I think. Um, but and Seneca really followed both paths if we believe that he tried to extricate himself when things had gone too far, and he realized he could no longer rein Nero in. Um, I guess, Seneca's question is a good one, is can you exert any influence? If you can, maybe there's good justification for staying in power, staying near power. But once you lose that influence, it's time to go if you can get out.
Okay, thank you. So it remains a question mark, remains based on context, based on the factors specific to your individual situation.
I think so. I think, as I said in my closing, all these things are highly contingent. And Seneca himself found that he couldn't find a clear path. There was no dogma to his actions, either entering or trying to leave the palace. It's all very contingent.
All right. Well, thank you so much, James. Phil, did you want to close things out now?
I don't think I have a better question. I think James gave us a lot to think about in this space. And I just want to say I want to appreciate all that you've done for us and with us and bringing these ideas to bear. And I think even now, as we look at this and we say, I don't know, even Seneca didn't seem to know exactly what the right thing to do was. He wrestled with this. And I'm going to bring this up just as a Stoic, not a historian. I don't have that piece of this, but as a Stoic, we're explaining to people all the time. This is a philosophy of virtue ethics. And this means that it is mostly not prescriptive. It is not going to tell you exactly what to do. It's going to tell you you're going to consider these virtues and weigh them against that thing at the moment. And two wise people might come to different ideas. And in this case, those two wise people might have lived inside of Seneca with different ideas, right? Very well. James, thank you so much for being here. It's just a treat to have you. Thank you.
Thank you.
James.